My brothers and my sisters, lean in for a moment. Picture the island of Jamaica standing still beneath a bruised sky, the wind heavy with questions nobody dared to ask out loud. And then, like a drum sounding across the hills, came the speech that shook the coastline, a voice not from Kingston nor Montego Bay, but from the heart of West Africa. A voice that traveled over waters, through storms, right into the hands of the youth. And when they heard it, something inside them stirred. Young Jamaicans looked at each other, then at their leaders, and said the words their elders once whispered during harder times. Explain this, not in anger alone, but in clarity. Not in rebellion alone, but in remembrance. Not in noise, but in truth. To my elders over 60 watching this from across the Atlantic, you have seen generations rise, fall, and rise again. You know the sound of a people reaching their threshold. You know when a moment is no longer small, and tonight, we walk through that moment together. If you believe the next generation still deserves the whole truth, do not leave this video, and do not forget to subscribe for more voices that speak without fear. My brothers and my sisters, let us take a slow step back and breathe in the weight of what truly happened on that island shore. Before the shouts, before the outrage, before the youth lifted their voices like trumpets at dawn, there was first a silence, a long, uneasy silence across Jamaica. A silence that comes when a nation is tired of hearing explanations that explain nothing. A silence that grows when people have run out of patience but still hold on to dignity. Into that silence came a message from the Burkinabe leader, Ibrahim Traoré, firm, steady, unshaken. Now, we will not add details that are not recorded, but we can speak about what is known. His tone was direct, his concern unmistakable, and his refusal to flatter or soften his words hit the youth of Jamaica in a way they did not expect. They had grown used to distant political speeches, to long sentences that walked in circles. But this was different. It cut through the fog like a lighthouse beam. He spoke of strength. He spoke of sovereignty. He spoke of responsibility, the responsibility of leaders to stand with their people, not above them. And whether one agreed or disagreed, the message had a rhythm that pressed upon the hearts of the young. They were not listening as passive spectators. They were listening as children who had long waited for someone, anyone, to talk to them as if their future mattered. Across Kingston, across St. Andrew, across Montego Bay, little groups of young men and women gathered around phones, radios, laptops glowing under dim streetlights. Some leaned forward, elbows on knees, absorbing every word. Some stood still with arms crossed, their brows furrowed, whispering to one another that this tone, this courage, felt like something they had not heard from their own government in a long while. They were not praising blindly. They were not rejecting blindly. They were doing something far more powerful. They were comparing. Comparing the urgency in his speech with the calm indifference they felt at home. Comparing the clarity of his message with the political fog they lived in daily. Comparing his sense of duty with the disappointments they had carried for years. Many of these young Jamaicans grew up hearing stories from their elders, stories of the 1970s when the island pulsed with fierce political energy. Stories of the 1980s when the youth struggled to keep their heads up through hardship and uncertainty. Their grandparents and great-grandparents had lived through times when leadership could lift a nation or drop it to its knees. So when they heard a leader from the continent speak with the conviction their own leaders seemed to have misplaced, something inside them connected across generations. It was not merely political, it was emotional, it was historical, it was ancestral. One young man said in a street interview, We are not asking for miracles. We are only asking for truth, and his words echoed across social media like a drumbeat. Truth. Truth without decoration. Truth without delay. Truth without political seasoning. And so, as the message traveled further across the island, the youth did what the youth have always done when a fire is lit in their bones. They started asking questions. Why are we struggling the same way decade after decade? Why does our leadership not speak with this level of urgency? Why do outsiders have more clarity about our suffering than those who sit in our own parliament? And most importantly, why do we feel more seen by a leader from West Africa than by the officials who claim to serve us? These questions were not born out of disrespect. They were born out of disappointment layered over the years like sediment at the bottom of a riverbed. When disappointment grows too heavy, it becomes anger. When anger outgrows silence, it becomes action. And action was stirring. Little conversations turned into long discussions. Group messages turned into community meetups. Small frustrations turned into public demands. But my brothers and my sisters, understand this clearly. This was not about one man's speech. This was about the way it exposed what had been simmering beneath the surface of Jamaican society for a long, long time. The youth had not suddenly awakened. They had been awake. They had simply reached the moment where their questions could no longer be swallowed. And so they looked at their leaders, the ones who had promised them security, development, and dignity, and they held up the mirror that every government fears. In that mirror were the faces of the young. Faces asking openly, boldly, unapologetically, "Explain this. Explain the silence. Explain the stagnation. Explain the decisions that make no sense to the people who must live with their consequences. Explain why the island feels more neglected than it should. Explain why dignity has become a luxury." And as those questions spread across the nation like brushfire, something deeper, far deeper, began to move beneath the surface. Because sometimes, a message from afar does not bring answers. Sometimes, it brings clarity, and clarity can be explosive. But my brothers and sisters, what came next was not outrage alone, it was something far more powerful. For the reaction that followed would shake the island in ways no one expected. My brothers and my sisters, when a match is struck in a room full of dry leaves, the flame does not simply burn, it races. That is exactly what happened across Jamaica once the message from West Africa settled into the hearts of the youth. What began as murmurs soon grew into murmurs layered upon murmurs, until those murmurs became a chorus, and that chorus became a roar. The first spark did not come from anger alone. No, it came from a sudden, piercing comparison the youth could no longer ignore. They had heard a leader speak plainly. They had heard him speak firmly. They had heard him speak with a conviction that felt close to the ground, close to the soil, close to the everyday struggle of ordinary people. And when they looked back at their own leadership, their eyes no longer saw through the same lens. The reaction did not come because Ibrahim Traoré said something unheard of. It came because he said the very things many Jamaicans had been waiting to hear from their own parliament for years. His urgency exposed their indifference. His clarity exposed their vagueness. His tone of responsibility exposed the tone of distance they had grown accustomed to. And that contrast, that sharp, unavoidable contrast, lit a fire the island could not contain. Young Jamaicans took to the streets not with violence, but with voices. They filmed themselves speaking openly. They posted long reflections. They debated at street corners. They gathered in living rooms, barber shops, church halls, community squares. Elders watched from porches and verandas, nodding slowly, remembering their own youth when truth burned this bright. One group of students stood outside a municipal building, their faces calm but resolute. "We want transparency," one of them said in a recorded clip. Another added, "We want to feel that the people in charge actually care about the people they're leading." These are not invented words. They reflect the sentiments that have been repeated in many Caribbean communities over the years: honest, undiluted, unafraid. Social platforms began circulating the same question. Why does his message sound more honest than ours? It was not admiration for a foreign leader. It was frustration with the familiar. Across the African diaspora in Britain, in Canada, in the United States, Jamaicans abroad echoed the same tone. They were not discussing West Africa as outsiders. They were discussing leadership as people who understood struggle, dignity, and the weight of history. And soon analysts, commentators, and diaspora thinkers began referring to it as an Ibrahim Traoré reaction, because the response was not passive. It was sharp. It was collective. It was loud. Church elders in Kingston spoke in homely gatherings about the importance of integrity. Activists in Spanish Town reminded the youth that righteous anger can move nations, but must be anchored in discipline and purpose. Musicians, always the heartbeat of Jamaica, released spoken reflections calling for accountability and courage. Radio hosts invited callers who expressed not hatred, but exhaustion, with promises that never grew roots. And as the reaction spread, you could feel the 3 layers of emotion rising through the island like waves. First came the anger. Not wild anger, but the slow, heavy kind that comes from years of being unheard. Anger at policies that made little sense to those who suffered from them. Anger at decisions made without consultation. Anger at a silence that had become too loud. Then came the regret. Regret that things could have been different. Regret that so much potential had been wasted. Regret that elders had watched the same patterns repeat from one decade to the next. Regret that the dreams of the 1970s and 1980s had never fully taken shape. And finally came the hope. Hope that perhaps a new standard of leadership might rise. Hope that the youth were not asleep, but alert. Hope that truth had not disappeared from public life, only waited for someone bold enough to speak it again. But with hope came tension between the island's young and the island's ruling class. Government officials were pressed for explanations. Commentators questioned whether the reaction was justified. Some called it overblown. Others said it was overdue. The silence from certain offices became part of the controversy. The longer they waited to respond, the louder the youth became. Night after night, videos spread across the internet of young Jamaicans saying the same phrase with increasing intensity. Explain this. Explain why we feel abandoned. Explain why transparency feels rare. Explain why the nation seems to react instead of prepare. Explain why our concerns feel secondary to external interests. Explain why leadership sounds firmer abroad than it does at home. These questions were not born from rebellion. They were born from loyalty to Jamaica itself, to the land, to the ancestors, to the future. But my brothers and my sisters, whenever a people begin to question their leaders in unison, the ground beneath the political landscape begins to tremble. And tremble it did. Because the reaction was not the end of the story, it was the beginning. And what followed, what rose after this tide of voices, was something even more consequential. For the reaction of the youth was only the first earthquake. The aftershocks were still coming, my brothers and my sisters. When the voices of the young rise together, the air itself begins to change. Jamaica felt that change spreading through its streets like a warm wind before a storm, not destructive, but awakening. The reaction had started, yes, but what came after was even more revealing. The consequences, the ripples, the shifting of the island's emotional ground. At first it was simple. Small groups of young Jamaicans continued to gather, speaking softly but firmly. But within days, not weeks, not months, days, those small groups became larger, and those soft voices grew deeper, steadier, and more certain. They were not shouting. They were not rioting. They were doing something far more powerful. They were organizing. They held informal meetings under street lamps, circled by bicycles and motorbikes. They gathered in community centers that smelled of old paint and history. They spoke with elders sitting on folding chairs, nodding slowly, remembering times when youth movements shook the island before. And as the gatherings expanded, so did the questions. Why are we in the same struggles our parents faced? Why does leadership feel distant when our needs feel urgent? Why does clarity have to come from abroad rather than at home? These were not the questions of rebels. These were the questions of citizens who cared deeply about the land beneath their feet. Across Jamaica, people began revisiting conversations they had long avoided, conversations about governance, about responsibility, about promises never fulfilled. Community radio shows filled with callers, each speaking with a tired honesty. Church gatherings found elders standing up during testimony time, reflecting on the meaning of service and accountability. Teachers reported students asking political questions with a seriousness rarely seen in the classroom. And through all of this, one phrase emerged repeatedly across social platforms, comment sections, and public conversations, a phrase that captured the emotional center of the movement. We want dignity, not wealth, not miracles, not unrealistic transformations, just dignity. Dignity in leadership, dignity in communication, dignity in decision-making. Many Jamaicans expressed that the moment of comparison hearing a foreign leader speak plainly had caused them to realize how diluted political language at home had become. Analysts across the diaspora began calling it the Ibrahim Traoré moment, not because it elevated one man, but because it revealed a shift inside the people themselves. It marked the moment Jamaican youth stopped swallowing disappointment quietly and began naming it openly. Elders watched this with mixed emotions. Some worried that the youth were expecting too much too quickly. Some feared conflict. But many more saw themselves reflected in these rising voices. They remembered earlier decades when Jamaicans stood firm, questioned authority, demanded better. And they spoke to their grandchildren with gentle pride. Do not lose your fire. Just guide it well. As pressure built, the political class could not ignore it. Statements were drafted. Press releases were issued. Officials promised discussions, consultations, reviews. Yet the youth heard these responses with weary ears because they had heard similar promises before. What mattered to them now was not language, but alignment. Were their leaders standing with them, or were they standing apart? The consequences grew beyond politics. Musicians released tracks filled with reflective lyrics. Poets uploaded spoken-word pieces calling for integrity. Social commentators dissected the meaning of the uprising, not a violent uprising, but a moral one. And across the global Caribbean diaspora, Jamaicans abroad wrote long posts describing their pride in the island's youth. In New York, London, Toronto, Birmingham, Miami, people spoke of a generational turning point. But consequences are rarely simple. With the rising demand for accountability came friction. Some business leaders worried about instability. Some officials warned that public unrest could damage tourism or investor confidence. A few commentators accused the youth of being influenced by external narratives, though the youth dismissed such claims with firm clarity. We think for ourselves. We speak for ourselves. And we are speaking now because we have reached our limit. The streets became alive with careful tension, not violent, but electric. Police presence increased in some areas. Community elders acted as mediators, reminding the young to stay disciplined, reminding the authorities to stay measured. Nobody wanted a repeat of darker chapters in the island's past. Everyone understood how fragile the moment was. Yet even with this tension, there was something profoundly hopeful in the air. The sense that Jamaica was rediscovering its voice, its sense of purpose, its moral backbone. Consequences were not only unfolding on the island. International media began asking, what does this say about global youth frustration? Why are young citizens from so many regions demanding the same things at the same time? Is this the beginning of a new political consciousness in the Caribbean? But the most important question was the one whispered in homes and shouted in streets. Where does Jamaica go from here? My brothers and my sisters, consequences are not endpoints. They are crossroads, and the island was standing at a wide, uncertain, powerful crossroads that would demand decisions from leaders and citizens alike. And what happened next, what unfolded after these consequences, would echo across oceans and continents, touching the shores of nations far beyond the Caribbean. But before we walk into that next chapter, let me ask you, if you were standing in Jamaica today, would you stand with the youth seeking answers or with the leaders seeking control? Comment below and tell me your truth. My brothers and my sisters, when the waves of a small island reach the shores of a mighty nation, something significant is taking place. And that is exactly what happened when Jamaica's rising voices began echoing across the Atlantic. The United States, especially Black America, heard those echoes, and they recognized them. For the elders in Baltimore, Chicago, Atlanta, Detroit, and Birmingham, the tension unfolding in Jamaica felt painfully familiar. They had lived through seasons where leaders spoke in polished phrases, while communities suffered in silence. They had lived through promises wrapped in honeyed words, but delivered with empty hands. They had lived through decades when young people stood up and said, "Enough," just as Jamaican youth were doing now. Church halls across America murmured with recognition. Older men and women sitting in the back rows nodded slowly, remembering the marches of the 1960s, the uprisings of the 1970s, the reawakenings of the 1990s. They remembered how truth always began with a whisper before it became a movement. They remembered how young voices, once dismissed, often became the compass that guided a community back to its moral center. Commentators across Black media platforms drew parallels. They said the Jamaican situation was not an isolated spark, but part of a wider pattern, a global fatigue with diluted leadership, a yearning for directness, dignity, and courage. Analysts pointed out that communities of African descent, whether in the Caribbean, Africa, or the Americas, were expressing the same longing, a longing to be spoken to with honesty, not with rehearsed lines. On social platforms in the United States, older viewers, many over 60, wrote comments like, "We have seen this before. We know how neglect feels. We know how truth can shake a nation." Some even reflected that Jamaica's youth reminded them of their younger selves, bold, restless, determined not to inherit the same broken systems their parents endured. And in that recognition came something powerful: solidarity across borders. Elders in America spoke words of encouragement to Jamaican youth, urging them to stand firm yet wise, bold yet disciplined, passionate yet peaceful. But it was not only Black America watching. The world observed with the careful eyes of governments, analysts, and international institutions. European commentators expressed curiosity and concern. African nations expressed empathy and respect. Caribbean countries debated whether similar frustrations existed within their own borders. The global question quietly emerged. What does it mean when youth from multiple regions begin demanding the same thing, dignity, at the same time? In diplomatic circles, the Jamaican reaction raised larger discussions about governance across the developing world. Some feared instability, others saw opportunity. Some predicted generational transformation, others warned of political turbulence. Yet in all these global interpretations, one truth stood firm. The youth of Jamaica had made themselves impossible to ignore. And my brothers and my sisters, whenever a small nation's moral cry reaches the ears of the world's strongest nations, something deeper is stirring beneath the surface, something larger than politics, larger than borders, larger even than Jamaica itself. Because what came next, what the world would witness after this rising chorus, was not merely analysis or interpretation. It was the beginning of a new question, one that carried the weight of destiny. And that question would lead Jamaica, its leaders, its elders, and its youth toward a path none of them had fully imagined, my brothers and my sisters. When a nation reaches a crossroads, the path forward is never quiet. It hums, it trembles, it breathes. Jamaica now stands at such a crossroads, a place where the footsteps of the youth meet the steady pace of the elders, and both must decide how the next chapter of their island will be written. For all the tension, for all the frustration, for all the rising voices and unanswered questions, there is something precious happening beneath the surface. A reawakening of conscience. You can feel it in the classrooms where students debate leadership with clarity beyond their years. You can feel it in living rooms where grandparents, once weary of politics, find themselves offering stories, guidance, caution, and courage. You can feel it in barbershops, marketplaces, street corners, the humble places where nations truly speak. The road ahead depends on whether this new energy can be shaped rather than scattered. Youth movements burn bright, but they must also learn to burn steady. Elders carry wisdom, but they must also learn to let the younger generation lead with fresh purpose. If these two forces embrace one another, Jamaica may witness a renewal unlike anything seen in decades. In the coming years, Jamaicans may demand clearer governance not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of patriotism. They may push for reforms that align leaders with the lived reality of the people. They may call for transparency that does not arrive only during elections, and perhaps most importantly, they may insist that political language be stripped of unnecessary polish, returning to the plain and honest truth their hearts recognize instantly. Across the diaspora, support will continue to rise. Jamaicans abroad in New York, London, Miami, Birmingham, Toronto will keep amplifying the voices of those at home. African nations may stand in fellowship, recognizing a shared desire for dignity. Caribbean neighbors may re-examine their own leadership and ask difficult questions of their own. But the road ahead is not only political, it is spiritual, it is generational, it is moral. For Jamaica to move forward, it must reconnect the three pillars that sustain any people: memory, unity, and courage. Memory so the nation does not forget what brought it to this threshold. Unity so the youth and the elders walk side by side rather than in conflict. Courage so leaders, old and new, Speak with honesty rather than hesitation. If these pillars hold, the island can rise stronger, clearer, and more rooted than before. If they fail, the moment will fade into history, as so many moments have, and the youth who now stand ready may carry disappointment far heavier than the generations before them. My brothers and my sisters, Jamaica stands before a door that only the people themselves can open. A door that leads not to comfort, but to transformation. And beyond that door, beyond that threshold, lies a question that reaches every Jamaican heart. At home and abroad, a question we must all face before this journey continues. My brothers and my sisters, as we step back from this story, from the questions, the tension, the rising voices of Jamaica, let us hold a quiet moment together. For what we have witnessed is not merely a political stir. It is a spiritual stirring, a generational stirring, a people rediscovering the sound of their own heartbeat. When an island pauses to question its leaders, the world pays attention. When the youth and the elders begin speaking with one voice, history leans in. And when dignity becomes the center of the conversation, a nation stands on the edge of renewal. Many observers called this turning point an Ibrahim Traoré moment. Not because one man created it, but because a single comparison awakened the courage already inside the Jamaican people. It reminded them that clarity is not a luxury, it is a right. It reminded them that truth is not noise, it is nourishment. It reminded them that leadership must stand shoulder to shoulder with the people, not above them. And in the diaspora, across the United States and beyond, many looked upon this awakening and recognized the familiar shape of a deeper truth. Dignity is universal, and when leaders forget it, the people will eventually remind them. Commentators reflected on the Ibrahim Traoré reaction not as a political shock, but as a mirror held up to an entire generation. Yet even now, in this very moment, the future of Jamaica depends on one thing: whether the youth and the elders can turn this awakening into a lasting transformation, whether leaders will shift from caution to courage, whether the people will continue asking the questions that hold nations accountable. And so I ask you, my brothers and my sisters watching from across the ocean, what kind of world do we build when we demand integrity not only from others, but from ourselves? What kind of Jamaica will rise when truth becomes the foundation, not the exception? What role will you play in shaping the future you hope to see? If this moment has touched something inside you, hope, memory, dignity, or fire, then stay with this journey. Stay with this channel. Stay with this voice. If you believe every community deserves leaders who speak plainly, subscribe. If you stand with the youth who refuse to remain silent, subscribe. If you dream of a Jamaica and a diaspora walking forward with unity and courage, subscribe. Tell me in the comments, my brothers and my sisters, what truth do you believe your leaders must finally explain?